Moment for everyone to load into this session. We'll get started momentarily. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to welcome you to WITA's webinar platform. We've got a great event this morning, but before we get to today's topic at hand, a few housekeeping items. Today is actually part one of a two-part series of events. We actually started planning next week's event first to look at the trade policy impacts of U.S. industrial policies in the CHIPS Act and in the climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. That event takes place next Thursday, September 22nd at 11 a.m. We've also announced speakers for the WITA Academy's three-day intensive trade seminar coming up on September 30th, October 3rd, and October 4th. We have an all-star faculty teaching these sessions, and if you or one of your colleagues want to learn how trade policy is made in the U.S., we hope you'll join us. Information about these events is available at our website, www.wita.org. If you joined us on any of our past webinars, you know we like to tell you about some of those you are in community with at today's Zoom, even if you can't see them. So welcome today to Tammy Dietz at the Washington State Department of Commerce, Sun Park at the University of British Columbia, Benedict Fleischer at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Shannon Taylor at Intel. Welcome, Tammy, Sun, Benedict, Shannon, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab, and Clete will try to weave those into the conversation as we go today. You should have also received a copy of today's event program and biographies of our speakers by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. As I mentioned, next Thursday, we're discussing U.S. investments in semiconductors, clean tech, and the critical technologies of the future. As we plan that event, however, we asked ourselves, what's the motivation for this massive investment in the U.S. competitiveness? Why did the U.S. need a CHIPS Act? In large part, we realized it's because of the competition with China, which begs the question, what are China's industrial policies? What are the implications of Made in China 2025? And can the Chinese system succeed in surpassing the U.S. leadership in innovation? We have a wonderful panel today who will attempt to answer these questions, welcoming three new guests on the WITA webinar platform. Anna Ashton, who recently left the Asia Society Policy Institute for the Eurasia Group and began her career as an intelligence officer for the Department of Defense. Gerard DiPippo, currently at CSIS and formerly a Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Economic Issues at the National Intelligence Council, excuse me. Both Anna and Gerard have written extensively about China's industrial policies, and we're delighted to welcome them here today. We're also pleased to welcome Professor Michael Beckley from Tufts University and the American Enterprise Institute. Michael has written a new book with Hal Brand's Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China, which has been getting a lot of attention in Washington. And so welcome Anna, Gerard, and Michael, and welcome, of course, to our moderator, my good friend Clete Willems, who many of you know. Clete is a partner at Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and the former Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. Thank you all for joining us. Clete?
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with three excellent experts. It's going to be a really, hopefully enlightening and fun dialogue this morning. We're going to keep it as lively as we can. So as Ken mentioned, the goal today is really to dive into China's industrial policy, to understand the origins, the purpose behind it, how it's evolved over time, and what it looks like today, as well as whether or not it's been particularly effective. And I think this is absolutely crucial to set up next week's conversation about the U.S. industrial policy response, but also to think through all the different kinds of measures that we may take in response to China's industrial policy. To put it plainly, we need to have a clear understanding of what we're up against. What is the magnitude of the challenge? What are ways that we can exploit some of the things that China does to our advantage so that we can have effective policy responses? And I do worry sometimes that we don't really level set on this issue. And I think like many folks in Washington, I would view and I would characterize China as an existential threat to our economic and political leadership, as a threat to our national security. But I do think it's important that we actually get a clear picture of whether the things that they're doing to try to surpass us are actually effective or not, and so that we don't fall into the same mistakes that they may be making, and that we don't lose sight of the fact that our policies of a free market democratic society have served us very well over time and put us in the position that we are today. So again, I think it's really important that we get a clear picture of what's happening in China so that we take the appropriate responses to that challenge. And so today, I think what we're going to do is sort of start by walking through what things look like in China, what their industrial policy mix is today and what it has been. And then at the end of the discussion, I do hope we get a little bit of time to sort of think through, in light of what we've discussed, what we should be looking at from a policy perspective. So with that, I want to start with Michael, who has done a lot of work on the origins of China's industrial policy, to kick us off with an intro. And then after Michael, we'll go to Gerard and Anna, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Michael, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Cleet, for leading the discussion, and Ken for organizing, and to all of you for being here. I'll just do some quick table setting. I mean, I think as most people on this call are probably aware, what China is doing is extraordinarily massive and ambitious. The amount of spending that's going into the industrial policy is more than double in absolute terms what the United States is spending, and more than double what South Korea is spending as a share of its economy, and that's the second place country. It's also just uniquely ambitious because China is no longer just trying to catch up in existing industries. They're trying to leapfrog ahead in many emerging technologies. And this industrial policy is part of what I see as sort of a 1-2 punch with the Belt and Road Initiative, and this attempt to kind of carve out new markets around the world and then get other countries hooked on Chinese finance and technology and goods and services. So it's a very ambitious policy, although the main argument that I'm going to try to make in the next 2 minutes or so is that the origins of this largely come as reactions to the slowdown in China's economic rise that starts in the late 2000s and extends over the course of the 2010s, and that this is actually a very common historical response, that when rising powers start to slow down, they tend to react with mercantilist expansion. So industrial policy and protectionism at home, and economic expansion abroad to try to carve out privileged economic zones where their firms can get easy access to consumers, to raw materials, and can basically set up little mini economic empires to kind of sustain their economic security and try to rekindle their rise. And so in China's case, I think you can trace back concerns about this even to the mid-2000s, which is remarkable just given how fast China was growing then. But Chinese leaders were already very concerned that their investment-driven growth model was, as Wen Jiabao said in 2007, was unbalanced, unsustainable, uncoordinated, and a bunch of other uns that I can't remember, but basically not great, right? And then the other concern they had was just that China was becoming a cog in supply chains that were already dominated by multinational companies in the United States, Europe, Japan, that, they looked at the statistics and, 90% of China's high-tech exports were just basically export processing and were being overseen by foreign enterprises. And so they said, we need to have some kind of reaction of this. Their initial reaction is the 2006 medium and long-term plan for science and engineering. And that's where you first get this emphasis on what they call indigenous innovation, this idea that we need to start making our own technology. But the focus was largely on catching up to existing incumbents. And there was a lot of space for market mechanisms, even within that industrial policy. I think what's happened since in the 2010s has been totally different than that. And I think it's a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, because all those existing pressures that China had suddenly get magnified by the crisis because world trade plummets by 15% in just a few months. And so all of those traditional export markets that China had relied on start to close up because of protectionism and a drop in demand. 20 million Chinese workers lose their jobs. You start to see a proliferation of labor strikes and protests, and Chinese leaders get very concerned about a slowdown and possibly domestic unrest. Their initial response is massive stimulus, and they've obviously extended that. That continues to today. China's taken out more than $30 trillion in new credit over the last 12 years. That's equivalent to like a third of the entire global economy. but they realized that the stimulus would eventually be ineffective, that it was going to generate a lot of waste. And by 2010, you had tons of concerns among top Chinese leaders about overcapacity. What are we going to do with all this overcapacity? And so the response that I think really gets launched by Wen Jiabao's government work report in 2010 is this new emphasis on mercantilist expansion, where we're going to have industrial policy at home and expand into new markets abroad. As far as industrial policy, you have this 2010 Strategic and Emerging Industries Program, and then that's followed up, obviously, by Made in China 2025. 2025 in 2015. And these policies differ from that 2006 plan. They're much bigger, they're much bolder, and they're really mercantilist to the core. So they're going to marshal way more resources. They're going to try to leapfrog existing leaders in emerging industries. And they're going to try to carve out essentially privileged economic zones abroad by lending out lots of money to developing countries, which they will then use to employ Chinese workers, to build Chinese infrastructure, to buy Chinese technology. And so this all becomes part of this broader strategy that I think now Xi Jinping has taken to the next level with this epic push for self-reliance as embodied in the dual circulation program. So I see this big push for industrial policy emerging out of concerns about the slowdown in China's rise, and then built out as those concerns get magnified over the last decade or so. So with that, I'll pass it on to my esteemed colleagues on the panel. Thanks so much for having me.
Great, Michael. Thank you for the introductory remarks. I have a lot of questions that I want to follow up with you. But first, I do want to turn to Gerard to give some introductory remarks and some of his views on this question.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think that Michael's comments are a great way of teeing it up historically. Around 2005-ish is when China started its so-called techno-nationalist turn. And we've done at CSIS work on estimating the size of Chinese industrial policy spending and comparing it to other economies. That might have been what Michael was actually referencing. There's a report called Red Ink, which you can find on the CSIS website, but I'm not going to summarize all of it. But the bottom line is, with very conservative estimates for how you calculate the Chinese numbers, Chinese industrial policy spending in 2019 was at least 1.73% of its GDP. That is more than 3 times, actually, than as a share of GDP than the other economies in our sample, including the United States, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, et cetera. The composition of that spending is, this innovation under Xi Jinping in terms of industrial policy tools was the government guidance funds, which had existed before, but they really got large and aggressive around 2014. The most famous being the National Integrated Circuits Fund, aka the Big Fund, which is in charge with basically funding semiconductor development in China. But there are a whole bunch of other ones at the subnational level as well and central level. In terms of direct subsidies, China is still leaps and bounds more than any other country in our sample. They report this in their listed firm data, and even that, our assumptions are actually pretty moderate because we're not counting some of the private sector stuff that isn't reported. And so it is quite aggressive. If you compare it to other economies, particularly Asian economies that had vaguely similar approaches to industrial policy, historically, the difference with China is there's sort of the qualitative and the sort of temporal differences. So the qualitative difference is the Chinese government more or less owns the financial sector in China, so they can allocate resources in a way that no other country can. The other thing is the party state, which has gotten stronger under Xi Jinping, allows for guidance and policy steerage in a way that other economies can't really achieve. But then if you compare China to its peers around sort of comparable levels of development by looking at things like per capita GDP, it's hard to get historical data on spending figures, but the broad point is it looks like China is sort of accelerating into the turn, so to speak. So they are on the cusp of achieving high income status, and yet they're still going hard or accelerating some types of vertical industrial policy. At equivalent levels of development, even in Korea and Japan and elsewhere, they actually were trying to dial back on it, even when it was actually smaller as a share of their GDP. So China's really an aberration in that regard. One of Michael's points about it, the market orientation of Chinese policies. They're nominally trying to make them market oriented. That's what the government guidance funds were intended to do, to have incentives essentially of private equity funds. But there are a whole lot of problems with that, which we can get into. And then finally, I'll just say, as sort of a meta commentary that will probably color a lot of this discussion, the question of what is it we can actually know about Chinese industrial policy and their success. And this is something that came through in our research. So, basically in the economic realm, not just for China, but in general among economists, the vast majority of industrial policy research is trying to evaluate their effectiveness. There are very few studies that actually quantify their size. Our study is actually quite novel. I haven't seen anyone attempt what we attempted. But in the case of China and other countries, because the data is not really good, it's actually quite difficult to get a clear sense of progress across all sectors or technologies. And it's even harder to determine causality. So are the government guidance funds, is industrial policy working? The approximation you're probably going to get is what is their apparent success in certain areas, but it doesn't follow that the policies are what's driving that. So that just, it's kind of a non-answer, but I think it's something we have to keep in mind.
No, thank you. That's great. And definitely will want to explore to the extent we can, what we view as the effectiveness of various of the policies. I think from the first two comments, we know they're really big. But let's explore a little bit the effectiveness when we get to the Q&A. Anna, why don't you kick us off with some of your thoughts on this issue? And I know you have also done some thinking about some of the recent trends and what's going on there with dual circulation, and would love to start to explore that.
Sure. I really just wanted to follow up on this good sort of lay of the land with how China has responded to U.S. actions. To what extent is U.S. policy contributing to China's doubling down when it comes to its state intervention and its industrial policy? And I guess, obviously we haven't dissuaded China from relying on industrial policy. The United States and other trading partners have tried for decades to encourage market-oriented reform processes in China, both through positive and punitive approaches. That was the great promise of China's accession to the WTO, and results have certainly been mixed at best. It's not true that it didn't work at all. China did become much more open and market-oriented in various ways, but the reemergence and flourishing of the private sector, really not the legacy state sector, is what accounted for much of China's unprecedented economic growth. And the state sector and state intervention, though, certainly persist. In fact, state intervention in state-owned enterprises have been resurgent under Xi Jinping in particular, who has sought to consolidate and strengthen China's SOEs. By conservative estimates, they still account for roughly 25% of the Chinese economy, and that's conservative. We've actually maybe been unintentionally encouraging Chinese industrial policy for well over a decade now. Michael mentioned the 2008 global financial crisis, and I also think that that's an important turning point for Chinese economic policy. I'd argue that that crisis changed Chinese assumptions and reduced the power and influence of China's reformers within the system. Beijing's doubling down on industrial policy can really be traced back at least to there, where China responded with a surge of state intervention. China protected its economy by introducing a stimulus package in 2008, which was the world's largest. The initial package was 4 trillion yuan, or $586 billion, which was at the time 12.5% of China's GDP, and 3 times the US bailout package. And that total stimulus ended up being actually even bigger, an estimated 27% of China's GDP. And the crisis raised questions about the reliability and superiority of the more market-oriented economic models that the United States and other developed countries had been pushing on China, and that reformers in China had also been pushing. In addition, China's successful recovery, despite the many downsides of that stimulus and sort of the mitigation to those downsides that's had to take place ever since, it was more successful than anyone else in the world. And that suggested that China's own model had upsides it could be proud of. So the reformists within China's government suffered a blow in terms of their influence, and the anti-reformists were strengthened. And industrial policy plans since then coming out of China, like Made in China 2025, dual circulation, aspects of the 14th Five-Year Plan and the Common Prosperity Initiative have been increasingly ambitious. Overall, you see a China that wants to move its domestic industry up the value chain, transition to an economic growth model that's more reliant on domestic consumption and less reliant on exports, and otherwise become a competitive advanced economy. But there is and has been an element to these plans that suggests China is pursuing dominance in strategic global industries at the expense of other players. In response, the United States has increasingly imposed restrictions on Chinese end users receiving high-end US designed tech products like chips, placing hundreds of Chinese firms on entity lists, and passing legislation to stand up more domestic manufacturing of our own and make sure that we ourselves are becoming more competitive. This current era in US China relations, launched and sort of defined by the Trump trade war, was intended to get China to stop a variety of these unfair practices associated with its industrial policy, but has actually possibly intensified and accelerated them. Ostensibly, the policies were a lot like our response to Japan in the 1980s, aimed at persuading Japan to move away from its dependence on industrial policy, but a different dynamics in the US-China relationship perhaps have contributed to a different outcome. It hasn't resulted in China backing away from heavy reliance on industrial policy, but instead it's bolstering its state sector. As the United States shifts to overtly punitive and aggressive policy as part of a broader containment strategy, that has further undermined China's reformists who were pressing for more market opening and market-oriented reforms. And advocating for reform within China, increasingly looks like siding with the United States against China's own interests. So it makes it an uphill battle for them. US policy in some ways has accelerated the very trends we don't want to see in China. It's not that China has a problem with the United States seeking to bolster its own competitiveness or strengthen its own economy and workforce preparedness. It's that many of our measures are explicitly China focused and reactive to the perceived threat of China. And when I say many, I mean in this Congress and in the last one, we've seen lawmakers introduce 500 plus China-focused bills and resolutions, virtually all of them imbued with some degree of China threat alarmist language. China worries about the United States undertaking these sorts of efforts with a zero-sum mindset and is increasingly responding to our apparent zero-sum mindset with its own zero-sum approach. In short, we provoked reactionary measures from Beijing and have prompted China to take actions it might not have taken if we had handled the relationship and our own domestic renewal a little bit differently. It might have still taken these actions, but perhaps not as fast, not as aggressively. On the tech front, in response to restrictions on sales of US tech to China, especially semiconductors, China has become the world's largest buyer of chip making equipment and is rapidly building out semiconductor manufacturing capacity. More broadly, China is aggressively building out global relationships to better serve its economic interests through trade agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and through other sourcing and investment abroad to secure resources. And even our efforts to pause or slow down the trade war have been structured in ways that actually may have encouraged greater Chinese state intervention rather than discouraging it. So as Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute pointed out a couple of years ago, the phase one deal's additional $200 billion in purchase commitments imposed upon China actually increased the likelihood that China's SOEs and state sector would grow stronger as a function of trying to meet the targets, regardless of whether or not there were market incentives for meeting the targets. And that's partly because we didn't demand that China roll back its tariffs. So China had spent the trade war increasing tariffs on US goods and at the same time reducing tariffs on goods from other countries. And when that remained in place and this purchase commitment was overlaid on top of it, it sort of guaranteed that it would have to be the state sector that did the purchasing and strengthened the very aspects of China's economy that we were trying to get them to move away from. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure there's lots to talk about now.
Oh, definitely. I actually really want to get into some of your comments there at the end, but I'm gonna resist because I want to kind of try to make this a little bit chronological. And Michael, I want to go back to something that you said and that Gerard alluded to as well. And it really is about when we saw the shift in China's behavior. and when our, what in retrospect seems like a naive conclusion that they would join the WTO, become more market oriented, and become more like us. When did that balloon really pop? And I think it's relevant as we're thinking about the Party Congress, because a lot of people are looking at this and trying to figure out, is Xi Jinping going to consolidate power? And I think a lot of folks in Washington think that he is sort of at the center of our current problems with China, and maybe with different leadership, they would have evolved differently. But you seem to suggest that this was really actually happening earlier under Hu Jintao. And so I want to explore that for a second and sort of think through, when did this really start to shift in China? And what does that tell us about how we should be thinking about China's leadership decisions? If Xi Jinping weren't there, would this look any different? And so can we get into that a little bit? And Michael, I'll start with you, and Gerard, I know you sort of alluded to this as well.
Yeah, I think on the second question, I think the United States has a China problem, not just a Xi Jinping problem. I mean, there's no doubt that Xi Jinping has accelerated many of these policies and that he's incredibly ambitious. His personality certainly matters, but the more I've studied this, I've just found that a lot of the groundwork is actually laid under the Hu Jintao regime. And this is across the board for everything from Belt and Road, as well as the industrial policies, as well as, frankly, in the security sphere as well, and a number of laws that have allowed for domestic repression. And so I think Xi Jinping has accelerated many of those, but they have their origins earlier. In terms of when this all emerged, I mean, I think it was sort of gradually and then suddenly. So, Chinese strategists and leaders have been talking about how dissatisfied. I mean, there was this big conference in 2004 where, even though China was banging out, double-digit economic growth rates, the mood was actually very gloomy, because so many of the leaders felt like they were, again, just becoming part of these broader supply chains that they couldn't really control, that were dominated by these flagship firms, primarily from rich countries, and that they needed some kind of state intervention in order to galvanize their own tech sector. So I think you can see the intellectual origins. You could probably trace back even well before that. And obviously Belt and Road has its precursor in the going global strategy in 2000. But I really think there is this structural break, in the mid to late 2000s. And I really think the 2008 financial crisis kind of just pushed them over the edge to say, now we're in a crisis situation. We don't have time to mess around anymore. We need a series of ambitious policies. And I think you can, if you just look at the dollar amounts that are invested, if you can look at the kind of targeting they're doing in industries, and just the ultimate objective that they're pursuing, all of those things just become much more ambitious as you start the 2010s, and then have accelerated greatly over the past decade or so.
And let me follow up on that. So I mean, look, what I'm hearing you say is really that this isn't just a Xi Jinping thing. He seemed to have accelerated existing trends, has taken it to another level, but that this problem is going to persist regardless. Let me ask you, to the extent you want to opine on this, how much resistance is there to that within China? I mean, I think one of the fascinating things that I observed as a negotiator with China is sometimes they were at odds with each other. They're not monolithic in terms of their thinking about this stuff. And so, among the policymakers who can make a difference in China, how much consensus is there that this acceleration in this direction is the right way to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough to say. I mean, I think there's certainly, so I wouldn't characterize it as resistance per se, but dissatisfaction, because there's a difference. There's clearly a whole bunch of people that think this is going in the wrong direction, that it's incredibly wasteful, that it's just going to generate massive fraud, because it's much more efficient to claim that you're a semiconductor company and then get a big government handout and not have to necessarily produce anything than it is to actually do the hard R&D and to flourish technologically. But whether that turns into resistance to Xi Jinping, I'm much more skeptical, just because, I mean, he has crushed so many of his opponents. And while there certainly is a lot of resentment towards Xi, I mean, the political science literature is pretty clear that once you have a personalist dictatorship, it actually becomes very hard for there to emerge big splits and for people to actually generate some kind of revolution that can suddenly turn around all of the policies that the dictator wants to do, much less overthrow that dictator. And so I just worry that in China's case, that even though there are plenty of voices that sometimes you get them, kind of sprouting out in leaked documents or in things that are quickly spread and then censored on the internet, that's not going to generate much opposition. And then you obviously have a big chunk of people, the state-owned enterprise bosses, people that benefit from this largesse from the current strategy, these entrenched interests that are very politically powerful, that like the current system because it keeps their zombie firms alive and allows them to continue with this subsidized model.
No, that's super helpful. And I mean, I think, again, what I'm sort of hearing is there are divisions, but how far that goes in terms of slowing things down seems, at least at this stage, somewhat limited. But I do think as U.S. policymakers, it's worth thinking through, how can we exploit some of that resistance, which may or may not be growing. Gerard, I want to go to you now and sort of pick up on something that Michael just alluded to, which is the effectiveness of some of these projects. And some of these objectives in China. And in your opening, you talked a little bit, I thought it was interesting, talking about how China's industrial policies have led to excess capacity, which has clearly caused problems for us in the United States, in steel and aluminum and other areas. But also, it's caused a bit of a problem in China, in that they now have these industries that are not very efficient, and they have workers that they need to prop up themselves. I'm kind of wondering, why haven't they learned from that, and why has their conclusion sort of been, let's do more of the same, notwithstanding some of the domestic problems that causes them? Is there a reason why they haven't learned that lesson, and instead they've learned a different one?
So I think it's important, to the extent you can, monitor the specific policies and what you can actually observe, as opposed to what is often done in the sort of China community is you look at sort of high-level strategic goals, and those look more consistent over time. But as sort of at the tactical policy level, there have been changes. So on industrial excess capacity, addressing that was one of the 5 pillars of the so-called supply-side structural reforms in 2015. And, you could, I guess, try to dispute the numbers, but I actually think there's some truth to this. They actually did reduce excess capacity in things like steel and aluminum. They are trying to get away from heavy upstream industry reliance. The crackdown on real estate is effectively that. I mean, real estate is like 25% of GDP for factoring in all the inputs and outputs. And that's a government policy. So I don't think it's true to suggest that they actually haven't learned and it hasn't changed. But the broader thing that is consistent is the fixation with having frontier technology. So one other difference is that, historically speaking, is that industrial policy has been used by many countries, as Chinese officials will say, for catch-up reasons, right? But what China's trying to do is use it at the so-called frontier. And that is the really unique thing. In terms of reforms, I mentioned that Liu He was supposed to be this big reformer. He's in charge of industrial policy. He has an entire portfolio pretty much. And what has he done? I don't really know what the counterfactual is in a world without Xi, but I think a lot of the core question here and sort of the frustration in the West, a lot of it goes back to the 2013 third plenum, when they talked about letting markets play a decisive role in resource allocation, and how a lot of people read into that meant actual liberalization. And actually, in some things they did. They actually did open the capital account more for a while. They are attempting to sort of marketize industrial policy with guidance funds. They rely more on hybrid firms or mixed ownership firms, less on pure SOEs. So there are reforms. But the thing is that the Chinese government has this, I would say, fixation with technology. It's like a techno fetish to believe that frontier technologies are the core to development, when actually, if you look at what their own macroeconomists say, they say, no, that's part of it, but there's a lot of other stuff you're not addressing. And so I think one other thing, just sort of keeping in our heads, is that the cycles in the Chinese economy and their current problems, I don't think are really attributable to industrial policy per se. It's other factors, right? Like COVID and real estate crackdown. But I think sometimes people argue a lack of reform is why they're having the current problem. I think it's actually more complicated than that.
No, great points. And I mean, I think it's interesting what you said about Leo He, because I think obviously a lot of us in the phase one deal had counted on him to drive through reform as well. And maybe it hasn't gone as well as we had hoped. Let me follow up on this, and others please weigh in on this as well, sort of to get to the point of the panel next week and talk more specifically about semiconductors and really how are they doing as a result of their massive industrial policies? Because I'm reading what seem like contradictory things in the news. You know, on one hand, you see reporting that SMIC is now producing at 7 nanometers, and that has a lot of folks in the national security establishment very concerned because, you know, that level of production in the semiconductor space is considered to be, you know, cutting edge technology. On the other hand, I've been reading all these reports about all of the corruption in their system of providing subsidies. And that tells me, wow, those subsidies really haven't worked that well. And our companies do still remain multiple generations ahead of China. So level set for me, Gerard, you can go first if you'd like. Others, please jump in. How do we think they're actually doing on semiconductors in terms of advancing their technology?
So SMIC is their main point of emphasis. There was a scandal with Xinhua Unigroup about a year ago, which is another sort of conglomerate dealing with this. And there was a lot of corruption. There was the famous HSMC case where that was just straight up fraud. I think, you know, it is conflicting. It does seem like they're making some progress. I think they claimed 7 nanometers capability recently. They're throwing a ton of resources. Semiconductors is definitely their top 3, if not top number 1 priority, because they see it as a choke point that the U.S. can use against them. So I think they're making progress. It's hard to say, though, as I said earlier, what is that from? Is it really because of all the government guidance fund money? Or if you just throw enough resources at it, do you get some progress there? They also do things like trying to poach engineers from TSMC in Taiwan, which they've had some success with, right? So it's hard to know, but I think that clearly is the frontier of what they're pushing at is the semiconductor.
I want to bring in Anna here, but before I do, you intrigued me. It's one of their top 3. What are the other 2?
They talk about like advanced materials and green energy. I think green energy is one where they see, like electric vehicles in particular is one where they recognize there's a lot of commercial implications there. I don't think it's a final good as opposed to intermediate good. So I guess we just get less upset about it, but it actually is a very competitive field in China, one that's growing very rapidly.
Thanks. Anna, I'm going to go to you now to weigh in on this. And then what I also want to note in that context is when any comments you have on sort of the key sectors in China we should be watching as their policies are evolving. I know a lot of folks in the national security establishment here talk about semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. You know, biotech now seems to be sort of near the top of our list. So if you can weigh in on that, but then also I know you wanted to jump in on the sort of the semiconductors question.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the cutting edge industries are the industries to watch and worry about, right? Because that's the global economy of the future, and that's where the U.S., China, and others are competing to be effective and competitive. But yeah, I wanted to weigh in on the semiconductors just to make some comments about the effectiveness or potential effectiveness of U.S. industrial policy responses to date, because I think, you know, we've seen a ton of enthusiasm for industrial policy sort of reemerging in Washington, and you know, some of that probably makes sense, but I think it's important to warn that this really isn't a we can't beat them, so we should join them sort of situation. I mean, we do need domestic renewal. We need to be addressing our own socioeconomic challenges and investing in our current and future competitiveness. And that can and should include strategic thinking about where investment goes and how our tax dollars are best spent. But, you know, for example, the CHIPS Act, I think, is a really positive example of policy that focuses on U.S. domestic renewal and building up a strategic industry, but standing up significant operations in semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. to try to provide meaningful supply for our demand is going to take years and enormous amounts of additional funding. experts have estimated that we'll probably have to spend at least $150 billion. And it took us 2 years to get the $52 billion across the finish line. That $52 billion is essentially like a down payment for standing up this industry. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Taiwan's TSMC spent around $30 billion in 2021 alone, and has been spending billions and billions per year for decades. And where we have, for instance, Global Foundries in New York State with an operation that got up and running for about $15 billion, and it's now turning out something like 30,000 wafer starts per month at the 14 nanometer level. By comparison, just one of TSMC's fabs has the capacity to produce 200,000 wafer starts per month. So we really need to have in mind what we're trying to replicate and exactly what that will take, and also the fact that our system, there's the conversation about how effective and prone to corruption and fraud massive industrial subsidies can be. And then there's also the conversation about the fact that our government is not set up to greenlight that kind of subsidy as nearly as efficiently as the Chinese government is. We also may not be thinking fully about other costs and benefits of our current policies. For example, if our leading edge companies in the semiconductor space and other high tech spaces are cut off from their largest global market, China, how do they replace the revenue that they're losing there? Because there's not currently another market that is remotely equivalent, and we aren't pursuing the sorts of trade deals that might open markets to create alternatives. So, what can we create to replace China for them? And do we really think we're up to the task of creating a subsidy program to match that loss? And how do our leading companies then funnel funding into research and development to keep themselves ahead of their competitors, especially if their competitors are not similarly cut off from that same market? And just another stat to throw in there for everyone's thinking, I'm not sure that all of our policymakers fully appreciate the fact that while the US leads global research and development, 75% of our R&D in the United States is funded and conducted by the private sector. So if the private sector isn't making money, our R&D is going to suffer.
No, Anna, look, those are some great points. And so I'm going to first agree with you, and then I'm going to challenge you a little bit. And where I think we would wholeheartedly agree is that we need to look at the broader mix of policies in the United States and think of those as part of our industrial policy as well. And my personal view would be having a competitive tax regime, having a competitive regulatory regime, looking at using trade agreements to open up markets, especially when we're going to be doing possibly less trade with China on technology. We need to give our companies other markets so they can make up that lost revenue. And we're not doing that right now, and I'd like to see more of it. So that has to be part of the equation. I also think, look, I do think the CHIPS Act was the right thing to do. This is sort of a unique case in semiconductors, and I think the R&D portion of chips is probably under-discussed and undervalued. I think that is all as important as some of the manufacturing grants. So I think that's all well and good. But I guess what I want to sort of challenge you on a little bit is something you said earlier, and that is sort of underlies the response you just gave as well, which is this idea that what we're doing isn't changing China's behavior, and therefore suggests maybe it was a mistake to try to address this. And I think a lot of folks and a lot of policymakers would say we absolutely cannot stand still. We have to respond to this threat posed by China. And so how do you reconcile that? Because I just think from a policymaking perspective, we heard what everyone here said. We know that China's spending money. We know that they want to be the world leader in all these different sectors. So how do you reconcile that comment?
So I think it's not that what we're doing isn't changing China's behavior. It's that it may be accelerating China's undesirable behavior.
But we know Xi Jinping, he wants China to be the leader anyway, right? And he's going to do everything to make that happen. So I worry about that as a reason not to do stuff. So that's exactly what I'm getting at.
I'm not sure it's a reason not to do things, but it may be a reason to be thinking a little bit more carefully about how we're framing things and how we're talking about things. Should we even be thinking about this simply as I get that China is useful rhetorically in order to try to push through some of these policies, but using China in that way has downsides as well, right? Like renewing our own economy is fundamentally in our self-interest, regardless of what China is doing. And a lot of the policies that may be good for that are good for that, regardless of what China is doing. And so having more of a national conversation of what we need, sort of separate and independent from China, I think would be helpful. And also having more policy debate with that framing.
Yeah.
But also, I think we need to be looking at what China's doing that we're not doing. And China is, we can debate how successfully they're doing it, but China is certainly going out and courting relationships with other markets, other sources of supply for key materials, other countries in ways that we're not currently courting relationships. You said we need to be pursuing, trade deals to open up more markets, and I totally agree. And I think it's concerning that China is so aggressively pursuing that stuff and inking deals like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, while we are sort of sitting on our haunches, or we're pursuing an economic policy that doesn't really include those sort of traditional market opening pieces to it. And we're doing this in the context of a WTO that's struggling and a rules-based trading system that's struggling. And as China is inking these deals and building these stronger relationships, it may be pushing its own priorities and its own ideas of what the international trading system should look like in ways that we're not really responding to. So we may be allowing a context to be created that will make it even harder for us to compete.
Well, I definitely agree with that last point. And I think what I hear you saying is, we need to respond. We just need to be thoughtful in the responses. I guess I'm still, a little skeptical that we're going to convince China in any way not to do what they're doing, but we can still try. Gerard, I know you want to jump in, please.
Yeah, I just want to say, to not be too fatalistic about it, in the sense that I agree with what Anna was saying, that China did respond to our actions in recent years. They're on the one hand, you have people saying, well, it's Xi Jinping, they're going to do this anyway. But on the other, you say, oh, they're accelerating. But they're accelerating because of U.S. action. It's very clear, the 14th five-year plan is even more focused on indigenization than the 13th was. Self-reliance is the so-called most essential ingredient of Xi Jinping's new development concept. They talk about the threat from the U.S. So, maybe it was worth doing these policies for their own reasons, but they have responded to it. Now, my sense, though, is that the response is more sort of political impulse, less on the policy side, because most of those policies were in place to begin with, or at least a few years prior to, say, the trade war. In terms of their willingness to reform, I actually agree with what Ambassador Catherine Tai says, which is that, in effect, like, we shouldn't expect China to change its economic practices in response to pressure from the U.S., at least the U.S. alone. I don't think they will. They're paranoid about the U.S. and we're their pace setter, right? And they assume that we're just out to contain them. And so anything we're asking, they're going to think has nefarious intentions. So I think we basically have to sort of treat the broad trajectory of China's policy as kind of a given, but then also factor in that they do respond to what they think we're trying to do.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Michael, I want to bring you in here, but as I bring you in, I also just want to, in addition to whatever you're about to say, we're getting a lot of questions about sort of this question of working with allies. And I think in two ways, both in terms of how we might coordinate our subsidies. Well, I guess three ways. How do we coordinate any subsidies that we give? How do we coordinate on pushing back in China, including coordinating actions that would, shut off technology flows to China? Does it make sense for us to do that if our allies can jump into that void and they don't do the same thing? And then thirdly, just sort of the broader G7 agenda on how countries can work together. So if you don't mind, sort of jump in, please, as you were. And then if you could also sort of give some initial thoughts on that, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. Just on the first point, I mean, I agree with Anna and Gerard that, the United States can do a lot of things to heighten tensions with China, but I also just worry, kind of to Gerard's last point, that distrust is so embedded in China's perceptions of the United States at this point. And most of my research is actually going through sort of Chinese strategic writings, and you can go way back where they just assume as a matter of course that the United States is going to try to contain them and going to eventually try to choke out their rise. And this far predates, this is back in the early 2000s, they're writing about this. And I even have noticed that even when the United States is like ineffectively trying to do things in the economic realm, like the TPP, where the United States is sort of trying to negotiate TPP and then it ends up pulling out. In Chinese strategic writings, they took TPP as this dramatic affront to them, that the United States was basically trying to carve out an exclusive bloc that was going to exclude China, and that they were going to be in a much more difficult position because of it. So even when we fail, there's this presumption that the United States doesn't wish them well. And so that makes me a little bit more worried that it's going to be difficult for the United States to try to show good faith. I'd also just point out that, China is pushing in many of these areas for factors that aren't necessarily related directly to the United States. So like they have severe problems coming their way. This demographic crunch is going to decimate their workforce. And so it's no surprise that they're doing an all-out push in robotics and AI to try to make up for some of that loss of productivity. Their arable land has been destroyed through pollution and overuse. So it's no surprise they're pushing in synthetic biology to be able to accommodate that, or something like speech and facial recognition technology. I mean, they worry about domestic unrest, and they're building the largest police state, the most sophisticated police state ever. And so it's no surprise that, this is generating demand for speech and facial recognition technology. So all of these factors make me, I agree with the diagnosis, but not necessarily with the follow-on prescription that the United States can be offering olive branches that will really change Chinese behavior. I think you just get to a point where it's more about damage limitation and deterrence than it is about being able to come to a modus vivendi, at least in the short term. In terms of what the United States can do with its allies, I mean, I'll defer to my colleagues who are probably much more expert on this, but my sense is that what you want to do is stand up a bunch of mini-lateral coalitions that are targeted in these specific areas. And actually the semiconductors is a great example here, where the United States, working with Taiwan, the Netherlands, South Korea, Japan, was able to kind of stand up sort of a mini version of the COCOM structure that prevailed during the Cold War to limit China's access to the most advanced manufacturing technologies, as well as the chips themselves. That seems like a good ground base for sort of targeted export and investment controls. And at the same time, you can do all kinds of R&D sharing. I know the G7 has a whole range of initiatives now of trying to stand up these mini-lateral coalitions, not just to try to slow China down, but to do collaborative R&D. I don't have the expertise to know how you chop up, divvy up. I just assume everyone has their kind of comparative advantage and you focus on that. But it just seems like that's much more effective than what some people are saying, where you need this big, huge sort of economic NATO, or you need to sign these huge trade agreements. I just think those will both take too long, and they'll be so watered down, they won't really have the effect as much as this sort of coalitions of the willing targeted around major producers in the most advanced technologies.
Gerard, please come in. And one, I mean, lots of great points from Michael. Two, I'll emphasize. I mean, first, I think your explanation of China's reaction to the TPP should be pretty telling to us. And the concern that they had about the U.S. being part of that kind of arrangement. Second question is, and Gerard, you might be able to speak to this, is just sort of whether there's any analysis that has been done on sort of the effectiveness or lack thereof of U.S. measures that have been unilateral versus coordinated.
So on TPP, I mean, keep in mind, China is trying to join it, or CPTPP rather. I mean, whether Japan or Australia might block them is another question, but they're trying to co-opt the system that we designed and then pulled out of. I just want to flag on real existing coordination problems, right? So with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Korean government is very upset that it basically requires North American inputs for electric vehicles and high capacity batteries. And I think one thing we have to figure out with these coordination issues is when we talk about whether it's nearshoring, friendshoring, or whatever, you have to delineate who's in and who's out and why. And that gets really contentious. And I think what makes coordination, particularly of industrial policy, hard is that, if the two core problems of industrial policy are information asymmetry and regulatory capture, it's harder to manage that second one if you're dealing with like 5 or 6 countries. And ultimately, if you really want to coordinate that kind of stuff, you have to talk about maybe even spending US resources to go to other countries. And politically, that's very difficult. So I'm just not optimistic sort of on the high level industrial policy side that we can do that. But there might be forums or specific technologies where you can try to coordinate that. In terms of like research of Chinese industrial policy effectiveness, it's really not that good, to be honest. Like I'll say this. I actually do not have the impression that the Chinese government has a good sense of how effective its own policies are in a detailed way. I think you've seen that many times, even like with Belt and Road, they have this decentralized approach. They have centralized slogans and it's farmed out. And it took them like 5 years to realize there was going to be a problem with project management and debt repayment, even though it was totally obvious at the beginning. So I think one of my general points is I think Chinese planning ability is overhyped.
No, that's thank you for that. Anna, I want to come to you in a second, but first, Michael, I know Ken's going to cut us off in a couple minutes. I guess that's his job. But I want to make sure I get at least one question to you on some of your writing, which I found fascinating, and in particular, a recent piece that you did sort of talking about China's trajectory, both over the short and longer term. And if I could characterize it succinctly, the way I sort of read it was that you talked about a heightened risk of conflict in the short term as a result of what they were doing, but then felt that over the longer term, some of their policies would ultimately not be as successful and the threat wouldn't be as pronounced as we feared. So I just want to give you a minute to sort of maybe summarize that, tell people about your article. I think it should be required reading for anyone who's watching. And then I'm going to go to Anna for a final question before Ken tells me to shut up.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to promote a few things I've written. I think so. The book I just wrote with Hal Brands is sort of a new twist on the let's all freak out about China genre. Argument is that China is likely to become more assertive and expansionist, not because it's going to be inevitably getting stronger and it's going to displace the United States as a superpower, but because it has these liabilities, some of which we've talked out today. And we basically argue that China at this point is more of a risen power than a rising power. It has some formidable capabilities, but basically all of the factors that propelled its rise over the last 40 years, easy access to Western markets, lots of natural resources at home that make growth very cheap, a demographic dividend. So you have lots of workers and a government that's actually committed to the kind of economic reforms. Anna pointed out earlier that China's rapid growth was actually largely coming from an era where there were many more market-based mechanisms in the economy than there are today. All of those things are drying up, and you're already seeing it causing downward pressure on the economic growth rate at the same time that China faces what I see as sort of an emerging ring of encirclement, with countries starting to militarize and band together because they're afraid of China. And so, we worry that this actually makes China a more explosive near-term threat, even if it makes it a less competitive long-term rival to the United States, because, we go back through history and basically anytime you have a rising power that starts to peak, they don't sort of mellow out and dial back their ambitions and become a responsible or reluctant stakeholder in the system. They try to batter their way through these headwinds by ramping up industrial policy, by expanding and doing a smash and grab operation militarily, and by expanding and trying to carve out exclusive economic zones to kind of rekindle their economic prospects and satisfy their population. And we just worry that China seems to be starting to inch down this very dangerous direction. And so the United States actually needs to take a number of short-term measures to insulate itself and its allies. And then maybe, 5-10 years from now, once we've gone through this danger zone, you can come back for a modus vivendi with China. But right now, we just worry this could be the sharpest phase of U.S. China competition, even if that competition ends up eventually becoming a 100-year marathon. We just worry that there's this 10-year sprint that the United States needs to run right now, because there's numerous areas where the U.S. and its allies are horribly exposed.
Yeah, and I do think, look, I think this should be required reading. And I would just also say, I think we need to be cognizant of some of the short-term risks we have here in what we're doing. And again, I've made clear before, I think we need to be very bold in what we do in response to what China's doing, but we also need to think through how to do it in the right way so it doesn't lead us to a very dark place. and we can get through this period. Anna, let me close with you. I guess we're already at 11. I tried to get through as many of the questions that the audience was submitting. One we just haven't touched on, and maybe you can touch on it in 30 seconds, and then we'll let Ken come in and tell us to stop. Someone just wanted to follow up on some of your comments about sort of the effectiveness of U.S. measures and how they change China's behavior. And you had made a comment earlier about the tariffs and the purchasing commitments and what that led to. Putting aside that specific, I think the question is sort of what do you see as the strategic value of these tariffs at this point in time in terms of pushing back or reforming Chinese behavior?
So I don't personally see a ton of strategic value in the existing tariffs for reforming Chinese behavior. But I think that removing the tariffs without some sort of reform to Chinese behavior is also a non-starter. I think that this administration or a Republican one would want to leverage removal of the tariffs to get something out of China. And the problem is that there's so much tension in the relationship right now that we can't really even get to the table to have a conversation about what that something would be.
Thank you. And look, there's a lot more I'd love to explore, but I've really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you all have as well. And thank you to three great panelists. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. Cleet, wonderful job as usual, moderating, really grateful. Gerard, Michael, and Anna, thank you so very much for joining us today. Super packed with information today. I know I'm going to have to re-listen to this again just to pull out so much of the things that you were saying and learn more from this conversation. You were terrific. Really grateful to all of you for joining us. Thanks to those who stuck with us a little over the allotted time. Look forward to seeing all of you again next week as we discuss the U.S. policy responses to the Chinese industrial policies. Thank you all again very much. Have a great weekend.